A Feast for Crows, the fourth book in A Song of Ice and Fire, was released in 2005, half of what was originally supposed to be A Dance with Dragons. It came with a note at the very end saying that Jon, Dany, and Tyrion would all be featured in the next book, and that next book would follow soon after this one. In fact, it promised it the next year. With that said, 2006 came and went, 2007, 2008, 2009, until eventually in 2011, A Dance with Dragons was finally published. As mentioned, it was half of what the original book was supposed to be. And a lot of these delays and problems stemmed from issues with a number of viewpoint characters. The one that Martin continually cited over and over again is the so-called Meereenese Knot, which is a tangle of characters and viewpoint characters all around a single city in Essos that kept delaying his progress. Today, I want to evaluate that problem, what it took to solve it, and which characters might be causing Martin problems in The Winds of Winter, where similar things, similar Meereenese knots, even if they're not in Meereen, might be occurring in his current writing process. Being a turn of phrase based on the mythical Gordian knot, sliced through by Alexander the Great, the Meereenese knot is a tangle of viewpoints and plot elements that all converged around Daenerys in A Dance with Dragons. This book really doesn't seem to have a lot to do with dragons, but when you look at its actual development, that is a massive point of pain, as there are a number of conflicts going on there. Specifically, Martin is having trouble at that point determining when events are going to take place and when different characters are going to arrive at the city. Daenerys and several members of her court are already there at the start of the book, and there are a number of individuals all headed to that same destination by hopefully the end of the book. Those being Tyrion, Jon Connington and Aegon, Victarion at a point Euron was going, Quentyn Martell, Marwyn the Mage, and numerous forces of slavers who are all coming to attack Daenerys. Martin needed to determine the order in which these players arrive, as they have massive influences on each other and on the plot as a whole. Additionally, there are other timing elements that need to be considered, specifically where elements of Daenerys' story are going to slot in compared to both these arrivals and compared to each other. The best example of which being Daznak's Pit, which is initially much further on earlier in the story, and Daenerys' wedding to Hisdar Zalorak, which is something that happens earlier and later. Martin specifically says he wrote versions of Quentyn chapters coming before, after, and just before Dany's wedding, with the last of those being what he actually went with. All of these elements resulted in Martin writing and rewriting chapters in and around Meereen for massive swaths of time during the development of A Dance with Dragons. All of these sparring elements had him coming up with ideas for how they might intersect and interact if they are all pulled in at different times. And as we see in the current story, a lot of these elements didn't even end up coming to fruition. Aegon and Jon Connington never make it further east. They never make it to Daenerys, and Marwyn the Mage hasn't shown up yet and likely won't until the Battle of Fire. With that said, I don't think that the Battle of Fire and the Meereenese Knot is going to be a problem going forward in the Winds of Winter. First and foremost, Martin specifically states that he's sliced through it by creating the Barristan perspective in A Dance with Dragons, so that really allows him to view events in Meereen from kind of an inside perspective and allows him to further explore things and get the timeline directly in order and have less of a vague kind of centered everything, as after Daenerys leaves the city, there really isn't anybody to be kind of objectively keeping tabs on the politics therein. With that said, I don't think that this is going to continue into Winds for one key reason. He's already done with Tyrion's story. Well, Martin has said time and time again that Tyrion is the easiest character for him to write. Historically, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. I think he very much clearly was in Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords, but we see a lot of problems arise with Tyrion in A Dance with Dragons as he is going east and beginning to interact with other plots that he really hasn't in the past. Daenerys is going to be a big fixture of his story going forward. Martin has said that they're going to meet at some point in the Winds of Winter and have strong influences on one another, but given the fact that we know Tyrion's story in the Winds of Winter has already been written and finished, I think that signals the fact that Meereen's overall plotline is near finished too. When Martin writes, he tends to write revolving around certain plot lines, or at least when he has issues, it is often massive restructures and changes. Having Tyrion done, finished, finalized as this through line for Daenerys' camp as its entirety makes me think that a lot of these elements are, if not wrapped up, he has at least a concrete idea of how he is going to wrap them up. Victarion is either pretty simple to write or dead. Barristan is probably dead. Quentyn is dead. And Daenerys' story might be a bit more complicated, but I do think that her being tied to Tyrion will kind of ease that burden a little bit, as there are other perspectives who can kind of take up the mantle and be able to view Daenerys without getting in her head necessarily, kind of spread this story among multiple viewpoints rather than just being stuck with Daenerys. That said, Meereen seems fine. Tyrion is done, but the Winds of Winter isn't out. This news came in 2022, and we really haven't heard anything since that point. What other characters might Martin be struggling with? Where else in Westeros or Essos might there be knots forming? I do have to ask, what areas do you think are giving Martin the most trouble? What has held him up so far? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments down below. While you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and it is just nice of you. Martin has been much quieter on his development of the Winds of Winter when compared to other books in the series, most notably A Dance with Dragons. In this instance, we only have two characters that he's openly talked about struggling with so far. We don't know much about the Winds of Winter outside of the sample chapters that were released and the few mumblings Martin has had here and there, but there are two players who are at some point giving him trouble. The first of these is Bran, and that trouble is referenced a lot more nebulously than some of the other elements with Daenerys have been. Daenerys had this massive convergence of viewpoints happening around her. Bran has nothing of the sort. He's entirely isolated in the far north, and I doubt he's going to reunite with very many viewpoint characters until maybe the very end of the Winds of Winter. No, when we hear Martin talking about difficulties with Bran Stark, those difficulties revolve around magic and what that does to a story. Martin is fairly conservative with his magical systems, and he really doesn't want it to overall impact the narrative in such broad ways as to upend all of the very intricately crafted political schemes that have been ongoing. I think there'll definitely be a role to play of magic in those schemes, and I think the larger narrative is going to be much more magic focused, with the White Walkers and the dragons coming into the fore. Bran is kind of dealing with at least the former of those on a pretty regular basis. But overall, this kind of green sight time travel magic is something that Martin really doesn't want to delve too far into, it seems, as it could risk undoing the entire series if Bran were to do something wrong. The other character we know he has struggled with is Cersei Lannister. This has been a little less detailed in terms of what he's talked about as compared to Bran, but we know that in 2022 he has finished, quote, a clutch of Cersei chapters that were giving him fits. Clutch in my mind says like 3 to 4 chapters. It's more than a couple, which is 2, I would say. And this shows that Cersei was, at the very least, a problem in her early story, mid-story. I think that's more likely to be the point of trouble for her, as she is at present the only viewpoint in a very important location, that being King's Landing, as there is so much going on with Marjorie's trial, her own trial, and all of these different political forces, including the Sparrows, the Tyrells, her own Lannister forces, the Regency, her son, yada yada. With that said, she is also, I'd say, the character probably most similar to Daenerys in A Dance with Dragons in terms of having other viewpoints converge onto her location. King's Landing, as mentioned, super vital place, and we know that at least 2 viewpoint characters are likely going to head there around the midpoint of the Winds of Winter, those being Jon Connington and Aerion Martell, both of whom would likely be traveling with King Aegon VI Targaryen as he is beginning to gather power unto himself and hopefully ascend the throne. If I had to guess, those chapters of Cersei's that were giving Martin fits, that he's now done with, thankfully, were Cersei's early and mid stories, dealing with her trial, wrapping all of that up, and then finally intersecting with Jon Connington, Aegon, Aerion, and having all of these new interactions with viewpoint characters, and seeing what exactly is going to happen to Cersei going forward. There's also the element of her children. They are both going to be in King's Landing in pretty short order here, and we know they are both fated to die, so Cersei may be like to take some drastic action as happened in the show, which could also complicate things, as it would undoubtedly reverberate through a lot of different political elements. But with that said, I think Cersei's chapters are going to be a lot easier to write towards the end of the story as compared to the beginning, because I think a lot of it is setting up dominoes, knocking them over, and then just seeing what remains. So those are the characters we know Martin has struggled with. What little we have heard from him has signaled that. Who else could he be struggling with? I think there is one very strong contender that really isn't talked about much, and that contender is Samwell Tarly. Sam has not been seen nor heard from since 2005. That is insane to me. No, I know you're going to technically say, oh, he appears in John 2 at Dance with Dragons. That doesn't count. That's a mirror to Sam 1. I don't count that at all because Sam's story ends in Old Town in the last chapter of A Feast for Crows, and he is not picked up at all in A Dance with Dragons, and we hear nothing about him. The only mention of Sam that has been made on George's Notablog since the release of A Feast for Crows has been in passing once in 2020, where he's listed with Melisandre and Victarion and other characters. It's really weird how little Sam's plotline is being talked about. And it's not that it's going to be that intersected with other characters. It could intersect with the Ironborn, but we do have more Ironborn perspectives in A Dance with Dragons and with the Forsaken sample chapter in Winds. But there's been a really weird blank blind spot around Samwell specifically, and I don't know why that is. I do think Sam is in a very tricky location right now. As mentioned in a video a couple weeks ago, Sam is in Old Town and kind of a ship without a sail right now, insofar as he really doesn't have a mentor or guide at the Citadel. There are other students who can help him out, the Sphinx, Lazy Leo, etc., but all of those students were learning under Marwyn the Mage, this mad maester, and he has just gone to visit Daenerys at this point, as mentioned earlier. Sam is kind of rudderless in that instance, and given that he is in this place with such vital information, I could see Martin having trouble kind of weaving in all of the relevant information. And additionally, Sam's chapters in Old Town could be a good way to contextualize other things happening across the continent and in other viewpoints by seeding knowledge that might be only available at the Citadel with the reader. And I think that I could see Martin going back to Sam chapters to like add these little hints in there to later foreshadow it, as I think the small council might be a little bit on the back foot going forward here, as they're going to have to deal with John Connington, and the Maesters in Old Town might be the more kind of reasonable overall kind of guide to whatever's going on in Westeros at any given point. The far north might be having the opposite problem to Slaver's Bay, as rather than way too many viewpoints, there are too few. Our main view on the wall has always been Jon Snow, save for a little Sam Tarly interlude at points, but Jon is dead as of the end of A Dance with Dragons. He will undoubtedly come back. Personally, I think it'd be cool if he comes back as not a viewpoint character, but I know I'm in the minority there. But even before he comes back, there is going to be a lot of political upheaval that we need to deal with. There was a mutiny that killed the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, who had been this individual who had secured free passage for Tormund and the Wildlings through the Wall. That is undoubtedly going to have massive ramifications, not just at the Wall, but in the North as a whole. And having the only perspective at the Wall, this super important location, be Melisandre, who is very disconnected from both the Night's Watch and the Wildlings, could make things a little bit more difficult for Martin to write throughout at least this early portion of the story. I could see it getting easier once Jon comes back, but then you have to deal with Jon being resurrected and how he's different once he returns from the grave. Overall, that is a fairly interesting area, too. This next section depends on your opinion on wrestling, but after that clutch of Cersei chapters I mentioned earlier, Martin specifically says that he is wrestling with Jaime and Brienne. That has always stood out a little bit to me. That says that they are both together at whatever point he is writing for them. So either he's very early on in the story where they are still together and dealing with Lady Stoneheart, or the two of them stick together for a longer period of the Winds of Winter. I hope it's the latter of those two, as that would mean both A, he's made more progress, and B, those two would stick together, and I like their dynamic quite a lot. But overall, I could see them having difficulties as well. They're in the Riverlands, which is a very central location at present, and they're the only two viewpoint characters who currently are. There's a lot going on there. There's that Frey Lannister wedding, there's the Brotherhood Without Banners that they are undoubtedly going to deal with, and Martin needs to figure out what exactly they're going to do next. Jaime and Brienne really don't have a direction after Stoneheart, unless she gives them some directive. I could see them being sent after the daughters of Catelyn Stark, but overall, I don't know how likely that is. The only daughter that she really has a beat on at this point is she knows that Arya is alive, given that she traveled with the Brotherhood, but she has really no way to deal with the fact that she's in Bravos right now, or indeed any way to know she's in Bravos. Speaking of Arya, I really don't think it's her that is causing Martin troubles. He's mentioned in the past that he has enough Arya chapters already to write essentially a novella on her. I could see her causing some problems later on when she's coming back to Westeros and intersecting with characters from her past and from other branches of the story, but I don't think we'll get a ton of that in The Winds of Winter outside of maybe her last chapter or two. So Arya I'd mark down in the probably fine camp along with Tyrion. I think one roadblock that really isn't discussed enough are these battles themselves. For those who don't know, which is probably zero people, the Winds of Winter is going to begin with four major battles, which fans have dubbed the Battle of Ice, the Battle of Fire, the Battle of Steel, and the Battle of Blood. I think that these battles are going to be fairly okay to write in general. We already have, I would say, a decent bit of the Battle of Fire and pretty much all the prelude to both the Battle of Steel and the Battle of Blood, as well as a little bit of the Battle of Ice through Theon's sample chapter and the Ossa fragment. But the issue here is that these battles are occurring so early in the Winds of Winter, and they were probably written fairly early on in the process. Martin doesn't write chronologically necessarily, he writes more by character, but any character is going to have these battles as an early part of their arcs. The issue is when you have these battles that are so important and have so many moving parts, and you have that as an early part of a book, Martin, being the perfectionist that he is, can go back and freely tweak things and fiddle with things as much as he wants to make it fit the story as he's currently writing it. I think that's a big issue, as leaving these battles still on the cutting room floor and able to be edited probably leads to a lot of rewrite rates that really aren't necessary for the future of the story. Having more material locked in might be a bit better for Martin going forward, as he'd have more of a solid base to work from. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it, and it does really help grow the channel. I'll have many more videos out on A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, Dunk and Egg, all of that A Song of Ice and Fire stuff. I'm very excited to share it all with you. I am currently working on one of my longest videos ever. I just started editing it, and it is a behemoth, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. Yeah, I am excited for the future and what it will hold. Thank you all again so much for watching. I also have a Patreon, which I keep forgetting to mention. That's in the description too. Thank you again. Goodbye, everyone.